Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the author's books and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale. I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy. And today our topic is going to be freedom, that great American virtue that we are going to both celebrate and today on the podcast we're going to discuss. And we're going to kind of connect it to our last podcast where we talked about the decision of overturning Roe v. Wade and kind of the cultural ideology that's behind the pro-choice movement, that we're not just simply fighting on this one abortion issue, that yes, authentic Catholics, we really are fighting for something more, and that's a world that's based on an entirely different worldview. And one of the hallmarks we pointed out in our last podcast on this was that the modern culture holds up autonomy. Personal autonomy is kind of the highest virtue, and anybody that impedes on that is pure evil. Right. And so today we want to kind of dive a little bit more into that understanding of autonomy and see that what is one of the things that's at stake in this is true freedom, authentic freedom. And of course, one of the greats that's really laid this out well is St. Thomas Aquinas. We're going to dive into an exposition by a good Belgian Dominican, Servias Pinckaers. But before we do that, and kind of the way we're going to structure this is we're going to look at kind of the two opposing views of freedom. What is the church's view of freedom, but also what is the understanding of freedom that underlines this cultural understanding of autonomy as the highest good, autonomy as the highest virtue. And it kind of goes back, it obviously doesn't begin with, but it kind of goes back to William of Ockham. Sure. And so, Dr. Smith, to kick us off here, maybe you can give us some little background on Ockham, and then we'll dive into these two visions of freedom.
Right. Yeah, I would say that Ockham, William of Ockham, is a very good sort of example of thinking about freedom as autonomy, right? If that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And as such, is a really great foil for Thomas Aquinas in his view, because they really are very different views of freedom. I mean, really, really different views of freedom. And we'll try to sort of tease that out as we go along. Just a little bit of, I think it's helpful to have a little historical background and a little bit of metaphysical background when approaching Ockham. You can really divide medieval philosophy, I think, into two periods, even in its highest form, right? So we think about, I think about the high period of medieval philosophy covering philosophy in the universities, really up to the Reformation. Yeah. So that's the sort of higher period. Before that, there was some philosophical activity in the monasteries and monastery schools, but it hits its most excellent sort of professional exposition, right, in the university philosophy called the schoolmen. Scholastics, right? You can really divide that group, though, into two, really pre-1277 and post-1277. That is, 1277 are the condemnations handed down in Paris by the Bishop of Paris. I'm going to mispronounce his name, probably. Pinckaers is his last name, so Bishop Pinckaers. I think it was 240 propositions he condemned, right? And really, this is sometimes an obscure event, but was really profoundly important, had really large-scale consequences. Philosophy prior to 1277 in the universities and medieval setting was very Neoplatonic and was appropriating Aristotelianism into that Neoplatonic, I would say, / biblical worldview, right? In which you have sort of you think about sort of the cosmos and all of creation as a interrelated organic whole in which all of the it flows down from God, and kind of a hierarchy of being down to creatures, including man, and sort of there's this return of things back towards God in one way or the other, right? So it's all flowing from God in this sort of metaphysical picture, right? A picture, as I say, that's involves the reality of created essences which have intrinsic inclinations towards operations, right? And that all of that is rooted in the plan of God and sort of divine providence and divine wisdom. There was a worry, though, by many around the church, especially in the University of Paris, that this picture was too deterministic, that this picture limited God and limited human freedom too much. And so among the various condemnations, you can definitely say people like Henry of Ghent, but also Thomas Aquinas, right? And Giles of Rome were all sort of in the target, right? In fact, after the condemnations came down, there was an investigation made directly to see if the works of Thomas Aquinas violated these. In one of those odd historical turns, the investigation went on, and they just stopped, like never finished. They just didn't quit. They just didn't finish, right? So we don't know. But one of the propositions that was in particular of interest was whether or not the external object determines the movement of the will, right? Which is a kind of a fine point. You start to think about it, right? Is it the case that the external object exercises some sort of psychological determinism on the movement of the will, right? And I don't think that that's true of Thomas, right? But it's also true that Thomas thinks that the external object is the final and formal cause, right, of the movement of the will, right? So it does exercise some kind of causality. Is it deterministically? Well, that's another matter, right?
Sure.
But really understanding that later philosophers like Scotus and Ockham, when they're dealing with psychology, they're thinking about those 1277 condemnations, right? They're doing philosophy post those condemnations. So they're going to kind of err in a direction away from object determinism, right?
Right.
And that plays a huge role, if you think about it, in the way both Scotus and Ockham develop their views of the will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think that's an interesting point. And hopefully we'll get into that when we look at these two views, kind of what role does the object play? But also to, we do want to, shy away from, a lot of that, the determinism that, if this is, if this is so, then this has to be, So let's dive into these two views. So the way that Servias Pinckaers in his book Sources of Christian Ethics, and he's a Belgian Dominican, and he divides it into kind of these two views. This is how he words it: freedom of indifference and freedom of excellence. And so he says, this freedom of indifference or license, right? That's another way to look at it, license. This is Ockham's view. And then Aquinas' view is true freedom, authentic freedom, is freedom for excellence.
Right.
And so I guess, let's, as we go through these, let's see if we can kind of, just paint a picture like you've already started. What role does the will play? What role does the intellect play within this?
Right.
Do we need virtue? What is it that's moving us? What is the place of law? And so we're going to look at kind of a lot of these things. So let's begin with this, kind of the first point that Pinckaers points out with the view of license. And he says that the difference here. So in license, we have the power to choose just between two things, this or that. Like it doesn't. It's not, one of them doesn't have to be good. One of them doesn't have to necessarily be bad, right? It's just two different things, even between contraries, right? And then in Thomas's view, the power, this idea of true freedom, right? That it's a choice towards the good. It recognizes this inclination towards the good, and it's the ability to choose the good.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe even choose among goods. Now, I think on first blush here, to a lot of people, that's immediately going to sound like, well, that's not freedom, right? Freedom is the ability to choose between contraries. Freedom is the ability to choose between good and evil, right? And Thomas is going to, a Thomist perspective on this is going to say, no, right? It's not, right? Freedom is the power, the ability, still, it's important, to choose the good. So you're still choosing, right? That's important. See, we tend to think about choice as sort of almost unconditioned, right? Grasping of two contraries, right? Or one of two contraries.
The object, the object does not matter.
That's right. It's equally an act of freedom if I choose evil.
Yeah.
Right. And Thomas doesn't want to see it that way. This, I think, does, I mean, immediately challenges us, though, I think, in this sense, right? To think, okay, well, where's Thomas coming from? Maybe just one biblical note to throw in here, just in the mix, is to recognize the way in which the church and scripture consistently have talked about the idea of sin as slavery, right? That when we are dominated by sin, right, that's a form of domination, right? That's a form of slavery. That's not a form of freedom. You may be choosing, right, to habitually fornicate, but that's actually not, when you're choosing there, you're choosing in a slavish way, right? Rather than freely, right? Or an authentic sense of freedom. I think one of the things that helps to sort of make some sense here then is to think about it not so much as an unconstrained, unconditional choice, as thinking about it as a choice along a path towards perfection, right? And I think a useful entry there is to think about this: the nature of human action. Thomas, following Aristotle, insists on the view that all human action is for the good, right? So, why do we say that the will, the authentic freedom is choosing the good? Well, it has to do with the nature of the will itself, right? Okay, but how do we know about the nature of the will itself? Well, we have to look to its effects, okay? Right? And its effects are human action. So what do we find in human action? Well, what we find in human action is not, of course, that every human action is morally pristine. That would be absurd, right? But rather that human action is always motivated by something perceived to be desirable in one way or the other, right? That is, we only choose that an object that is presented by the intellect as desirable in some way or the other, either as honorable and praiseworthy, or as useful, or as pleasant, right? Again, in some way or the other. So that tells us that, human action flowing from the will is oriented towards something perceived to be desirable, right? So that's how we know, that's the proof, that's the experiential, empirical evidence that the object of the will is the good in some respect. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also points to, a key difference here is that, for Ockham, freedom lies in the will alone. Whereas in Thomas, that freedom resides in both reason and the will. Right. So that there has to be this there's this relationship between the intellect and the will, that there's no kind of vacuum that the will operates in, but that the will is always going towards a perceived good, which is there because the intellect has taken it in through the senses. And I think that
made a judgment about it, right? So because the will actually is not specifically, the will is not antagonistic to the sensible good, but it's not, but the sensible good is not its proper object. Right. Yeah. And so you don't want to fall into kind of an intellectual determinism where I see the good, therefore my will has to choose the good, or this is where freedom comes in, is that I have the ability to say no, but I have to have that ability to choose the good. There has to be that there in order for an actual exercise of freedom to be had in this way. I think so there's a lot there. One thing to say is the will only chooses that which is judged to be good or desirable in some way or the other. It doesn't follow that it necessarily chooses, right, this or that good. Notice what I said, this or that good. So it's only going to choose something that's perceived to be good. So say you're discerning between pursuing a vocation to the monastery or marrying Susie, right? Mm-hmm. Well, both of those are only choiceworthy insofar as, right, they're perceived to be good, right?
Yeah.
But it's not as if the goodness of one compels, the will towards itself, right? That's where you're choosing. Either choice, insofar as it's rooted in a perception of the rational good, right, is going to be an act of freedom. Now, of course, you could choose marriage because Susie just happens to be rich and you want to be rich and you don't care about her, or you want to go to this particular monastery because you think you'll live an easy, comfortable life and that kind of thing, right? Well, that obviously those are good acts, but those would be genuine acts of freedom if you're like, you're like some men do and they're struggling with the discernment, like, well, there's Susie and that's good, and there's the monastery and that's good. They're dealing with both of them, right? And whichever choice is made there, insofar as it's well made, that choice is well made, it is an act of freedom. Again, point of the example, always and only are we going to choose in response to something perceived as good, but no particular good is going to compel the will, right? So we choose freely. Now, I think it's essential in this, and I won't take us too far from Pinckaers, but to root this in understanding, when we say authentic freedom, some people say, well, you're just saying this is what you prefer, right, or whatever. But it actually has to do with the nature of the will itself, right? Mm-hmm. Voluntas, right, is the word for will, right? Mm-hmm. Voluntary is a word that, is an English word that's derived from that, but it really just means something like, it's going to sound really weird, but the willingness of the will or something like that, right? Like something's voluntary insofar as it flows from the will according to its own intrinsic nature, right? Mm-hmm. Now, its own intrinsic nature is, one, to go towards the good, two, to go towards the rational good, right? That's where intellect comes in, right? So when you're choosing the real rational good, that's freedom, that is voluntariness, because it's in accordance with the nature of the will.
The will, right.
It's not contrary to the nature of the will, right? If somebody compels me to commit an act of fraud or something like that, or somebody attacks my body, right? Mm-hmm. Those would all be involuntary actions, broadly speaking, right? Because they're contrary to the nature of the will. Right.
I think one thing, if our listeners are already like, whoa, guys, this sounds way too complicated for just trying to exercise good choices for the good, right? It's also because, and this is one thing that we'll make now and throughout this discussion, is that for Aquinas, that freedom is not this kind of binary thing where you either have it or you don't. Sure. But it's something that grows and develops with the human person. So again, by the development of the human person in freedom, is, like you said there, a lot of it is based on true exercise according to the nature of the will. Right.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's really it's really important.
Yeah, and that when we begin to exercise these on a more regular basis, right, it becomes a habit and it becomes a virtue. So this idea of virtue, right? So this is something that kind of Ockham leaves out, right? Mm-hmm. There's really no need for virtue.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask Ockham, I mean, it's really funny about Ockham. He's kind of wears the black hat in a lot of discussions of medieval philosophy, and rightly so. Let me say, I find him fascinating in an odd sort of way. But the funny thing is, of course, if you had asked him, is abortion wrong? He would say, of course, right? If you'd ask him if fornication is wrong, of course. I mean, like he was not some sort of like moral libertine himself, right? He just thought that that recognizing the wrongness of this simply had to do with faith and divine law, right? It had nothing to do with a broader picture. Of course, Thomas would also say, you can know this through faith and divine law, but he also said we can also know this and we can understand it more deeply when we see the underlying realities at play in sort of the cosmos, but also in terms of the human psyche.
Yeah. The psyche. Yeah. And, that's something else that it's interesting. This is kind of a side note. But Thomistic psychology is becoming, more and more popular. There's more and more things being written on it.
Yeah, it's great
as well.
It's great.
Which is absolutely fantastic. So anyways, I don't want to get too far off. But the role of virtue with regards to freedom, right? So for the person so in the understanding of freedom of indifference, this license, right?
Right.
To describe the act, it's simply kind of this kind of it's simply you have two things before you,
right,
and you simply will one of them, right? That's kind of the extent of the boundaries that kind of surround this kind of what Ockham would say, this act of freedom, right? Whereas for Aquinas,
that's all that's necessary. That's all that's necessary. Yeah,
that's all that's necessary, right?
Yeah.
Whereas Aquinas brings in the good, the intention. I mean, there's so many different things involved in it that again reflects not just the nature of the will, but also the nature of the human person, right?
That's right. Yeah,
the dynamics of it.
Yeah, and the key again to seeing that is that for Thomas, right, the will has an object, and the object is the good, not merely the apparent good, right? And so when you're choosing the real good, you're growing in freedom. So you might say every human being by your ontological status, right, has the potency, right, the power of freedom, right? He doesn't necessarily enjoy that freedom or exercise that freedom, right? Until, right, they begin to choose and intend towards what's really good and really desirable, right? And that's where you can talk about the growth of freedom, maturing into self-governance, right? If you want to use a more sort of Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American, terminology. That's a good, a good way of thinking about it. You think about your children and their maturation process. They have the ontological power of freedom from birth, right? Although they obviously can't realize them when they're infants or toddlers. But as they're growing, you're giving them rules, right? But then you're trying to habituate them into virtue such that they are capable of governing their own lives well, right? And so that's why virtue and the good are intrinsically tied into freedom, right? Because right, the object of the will. So again, freedom just means voluntariness. The object of the will is the good, right? And so it's not a shell game. I think sometimes people hear say this kind of thing. They're like, it's kind of playing the word games. No, it's a different view of the will. It's a different view of the nature of the human psyche, right? That its proper object is the good. And so when you're choosing among goods, right, but still they're really goods. Like, am I going to read Dante today, or am I going to read Shakespeare? Right, those are both really goods. Okay, you're actually growing in freedom, right? Where just like you're saying, right, that is voluntariness, that is freedom, right? The other side, right, sort of this freedom of indifference, almost kind of arbitrariness, right? Yeah, virtue doesn't belong to the essence of freedom, because virtue and the good don't belong to the essence of the will, right?
Yeah,
you see that's those two different views of freedom are ultimately come down to two different views of the human psyche, right?
Right. And then again, this is what's at stake. Is in the modern context, our world just takes Ockham where he didn't really want to go. I don't think.
Oh, I don't think he would want to go. No. He would want to burn all the steak.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's maddening, but again, this idea that the will can be kind of separated from outside constrictions, and that's what consists in an act of freedom.
Right.
Whereas Aquinas says, no, like there's a role of virtue, there's a role for
Right.
the intellect, for reason, right?
Right. Right.
You know,
Right.
to and this is, whereas the reason and
Mm.
the senses, the judgment, reason, all these things, this is what kind of is first there for an act of the will, for the Christian. For the
Right.
modern person, there's no real limit on, or there's no real object, or what
Right.
is
Yeah. I
it
think
that
that's, yeah.
moves, your will toward this direction and that direction? Well, they say it doesn't matter, or it's whatever you want it to be, which can be,
Mm.
my pure emotions, right? My
Sure. Sure.
acting in anger, right? That can
Right.
be a justifiable, because again, my own autonomy is the highest good, right?
Mm.
It's, that's just who I am.
Right.
I'm a
Right.
very I'm a very emotional person. Therefore, it's not wrong for me to act on my emotions, for my
Sure.
for my for my will for my will's primary motivation to be my emotions. That's not
Sure.
that's not that bad. Whereas we would just call that, well, that's kind of, adolescent. That's
Well, yeah,
like,
I mean, you're actually not acting with freedom there. I mean, think about the sensible good, right? In
yeah,
in humans, we do end up choosing in a way the sensible good
sure,
because we also see it with intellect. We think about the animals, right? The animals are moved in a way that's not free, right? Because they
yeah,
only go with the sense perception and they don't have a higher intellect to sort of look at the presented desirable object from a different point of view. So, like
right,
in a human being, you might recognize, oh, this act of adultery would be pleasant and exciting, right? And your sense appetite's stirred by that, right? But
yeah,
then, your intellect judges, and this is morally wrong and blameworthy, right? And so instead of going with Sheila back to, her, hotel room, right? You just leave the bar, right? Right.
yeah,
Because, right, even though your senses pull you towards it, even though maybe
mhm,
you're kind of flattered and excited about the adultery, right? Your mind, your intellect judges, but it's morally wrong, right? And so,
yeah,
and my higher and better good, right? What's
right,
really desirable for me is to maintain my character and virtue, and that's actually being freer, right, than falling into the
yeah,
slavery of committing an act of adultery. To speak about a concrete example that's just related to what I just said about what you're talking about in terms of freedom, right? Is, just think about the way we talk about the baseline of sexual morality today, right?
mhm.
The baseline of sexual ethics today, there is a sexual ethic, right? And it is between consenting adults, right?
Pretty low, pretty low.
Consenting adults, anything goes, right?
Yeah.
So,
And some would even argue
uh,
with that, sadly.
yeah, but the majority will still say consenting
Yeah,
adults.
yeah, yeah,
And so you have to be an adult, the idea being you have the rational faculty capable of making decisions in this area. And secondly, that it's consensual, that is voluntary in some way or the other, right?
yeah.
Um, Now that's a pretty low bar, right? Like as you said, for your norms, right? I mean, it's a bar, and I would sort of endorse it. It does need to be between adults, and it does need to be consensual, right? But what you want to add to it is, and for for what's really good and what's
Yeah,
really desirable, right?
yeah,
And what's really desirable in that, of course, is procreation, education of children, and the mutual benefit of spouses, right? And that takes place in marriage, right?
yeah,
So there is a real concrete example, right?
yeah,
Where, we would see, fornication, habitual fornication, promiscuous fornication, right, as slavishness. It's not
yeah,
freedom, right?
yeah,
You're basically submitting your higher powers to your lower powers, right?
mhm,
And acting in a way that's contrary to your own will and
sure,
towards your own human rational nature. Whereas the man who restrains himself, and then proposes to an eligible woman and gets married and has sex with her for procreation, education, children, all that, that person is acting with freedom, right?
yeah, yeah. And it's also, for the Christian to recognize, it's important to recognize, these, limits. And
Uh-huh.
this is one of the points, is that the modern world would see, Dr. Smith, you're just putting all these limits on my freedom. That's how they would word it, right?
Right.
You're really trying to push your morality on me. You are you're setting up, and so this idea, and we'll get into this in a second, about the place of the law. Does the law limit our freedom? Well, again, when these kind of these limits, or these bars that are set, right, when they're based on the objects involved, in this case human persons, when they're based on the nature of the human person in reality, right, they actually help you be more free. They actually help you,
that's right,
rise to the occasion and become virtuous, right? To use a good example, what makes a good baseball player, right?
Doing whatever he wants.
You know what? I'm not going to pitch with a baseball. I'm going to pitch with a football.
Right? I'm going to run to third base first.
Yeah. I only have to run to one base. Or, you know what? You have to count to 10 before you throw the ball in. Like, I mean, again, like this sounds ridiculous and we laugh at it, but again, the limits are there to protect the thing that we're talking about, right?
They make it
the nature of baseball, right?
They make it possible to play, right?
Yeah.
If it wasn't for the norms of baseball, there would be no baseball.
Yeah. I mean, a funny example. I don't know if you'll remember this one. There was an episode of Friends where they created this.
I have no memories of Friends.
Okay. They create this game that just has the most ridiculous rules, and they just essentially are making things up. Like, if you answer this question in 5 seconds or something, you have to run around the apartment. Like, it was just completely arbitrary and ridiculous, and nobody could follow the game. And it was hilarious because, again, there was like nobody could follow what was going on, and it was comical. And that's, sadly, that's where we are with, like, sexual morality. I think it is interesting that people do recognize that there has to be some bar.
Sure.
Right. And like two consenting adults, right? So the fact that we recognize that there's some bar here, it shows that, okay, well, we're inclined at, even if we're not fully correct, right, we're inclined to say, there does need to be some parameters with which this thing we call sex is to operate. If it were to operate outside of those parameters, it would be wrong. So we recognize, some kind of baseline morality. But at the same time, if we were to play the game of baseball with absolutely no limits, like, again, it would be impossible to play. It would be impossible to say this person is a good baseball player, this person is not a good baseball player. Like, there's no distinction between the two, because there are no parameters with which they're operating in that is agreed upon. Right. So what place in these two views of freedom, what place do you see the place of the law? Because again, the modern understanding is, laws impose, or an imposition on our freedom, right?
It's interesting when you think about sort of this standard of consenting adults. That is consistent with the view of the will as autonomy, or freedom as autonomy, right? Because you're not going to impose any constraints except that it has to be an exercise of autonomy, right? And really only adults are fully autonomous, and if they consent, then it's autonomous, and that's enough, right? I think now let's be clear about Ockham. Ockham, would say there is a divine law, right? And that we have an obligation to follow the divine law, right? Under God's sovereignty and his authority. And we'll be punished for not doing so, and we'll be rewarded for doing so. So that's, he's bringing in a bigger picture here. And then he also thinks, that the Ockham has a high view of the civic authority. Actually, he writes a good bit in his political theory, which, of course, part of him I've studied the most, about the king is an extension, right, of within certain parameters of the
Mhm.
divine law, right? He's there
Yeah.
to use the sword and punish, right? And constrain, right? The sinful populace. So you kind of see, right? The king is kind of like just kind of keeping everybody in line, sort of. For Thomas, I think you've already hinted at this, that, you said these limits actually create the conditions of freedom, right?
Right.
If there weren't the rules of baseball, then you wouldn't have the ability to choose baseball because baseball wouldn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with marriage, right? If there weren't the rules of marriage, marriage wouldn't be something you could choose because marriage wouldn't exist, right?
Right.
I would even prefer just to kind of say, not to think of them as limits, but to think of them as norms or commands that actually enliven, right? And support our exercise of freedom. They are external, right?
Yeah.
So that's how they kind of feel like a constraint, right? But in truth, if they are for what's really desirable, right?
Mhm.
Those rules are conditions of freedom, right? Those
Yeah.
rules
Yeah.
against our freedom. You think about, say, traffic laws, right? Is there anything inherently wrong with driving on the left side of the road? Well, yeah, but anyways, just kidding. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? But there does need to be a side, right?
Yeah.
There does need to be, otherwise, you would say, oh, but I'm not free to drive on the left side of the road, like, why
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
well, because we want you to be free to choose to eat a ham sandwich after you get home safely, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, like we don't want you to die because then nobody's free, right? So I think in that sense, this is weird. This is going to sound really weird, right? Obeying good laws is an act of freedom.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Obedience
I
can
think,
actually be an act of freedom.
yeah, this is the example. Tell me what you think about this. This is kind of the analogy I always go to when especially we're talking about law and freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Is a lot of times people think, oh, laws are these external forces that are trying to limit my freedom.
Right.
Right. And true freedom is almost anarchy. It's just kind of without
right.
any sort of law like that. But think about this, like because people do not follow the two commandments, don't steal and don't kill, you're not free to do certain things. Like, maybe if you live in a city, you're probably not necessarily free to go downtown at 2 a.m. Because you'll get robbed or shot. Like that's, whereas, if we think about, okay, let's imagine for a second a world that just follows those two commandments, right? Don't kill, don't steal, right? Would we be more free or less free?
We'd be more free.
We would be absolutely, yeah. For one thing, you wouldn't have to carry around a pocket of keys. Think about the freedom of that, right?
Locks,
think about the janitor, right? The janitor would be the freest man in this instance, right?
Right.
So right, because we wouldn't have to lock things to prevent theft. We wouldn't have to think about travel. Where could we go in the world? Well, anywhere. If we were, again, if everybody was obedient to these laws,
right,
the world would be a more free place, right?
Absolutely.
So and again, when the laws that we're following are based upon God's design for the human person,
right,
and reason and nature, right? When we follow these laws, we actually become more free.
That's right.
And the world and everything else around us, this is the other part, everything else around us, we can enter into that freedom to such a degree that they're able to. Right. What do you think about it? Is that
yeah, I think
accurate?
that's totally correct. It in this way, laws contribute to our flourishing would be another way of putting it, right? But it is, it contributes to our freedom insofar as it makes it possible for us. It creates the conditions, right, where we can choose the good, right, and in so doing, act in accordance with the nature of the will. I do want to add one qualification and then one application.
Sure.
Right? So a qualification is, when we're talking about law, we do need to keep in mind three different kinds of law, right?
Right.
That is divine law, natural law, and human law. Divine law is that, that part of the eternal law that has been revealed to us in sacred scripture. Natural law is that law of reason, right? Or that, that law that reason knows, right? Basically the moral law, right?
Right.
It's both revealed in scripture and also something that we can know through reason, right? So those are basic moral norms that, we should know. But then there's also human law, right? And it's important to say, I want to say two things here. One, divine law and natural law sort of apply sort of universally, right? Human law is a little more tricky, is a little trickier,
Sure.
right? Because you think like the law in France is not the law in the United States, so there's going to be some diversity there, with respect to human law. Hopefully there's going to be a lot of overlap, right, in terms of it being consistent with the natural law. But it is important to recognize two things. One, the scope of human law is more narrow, is more narrow than the scope of divine law and natural law, right?
Yeah.
That is just so. I just want to qualify. A good human law will direct us towards something that is really good, right, and thereby support our freedom. You could still have a law that directed us towards a good, but was not was outside the scope of its legitimate bounds. Does that make sense? So there are things, plenty of things, right, that both the church and right reason teach us really belong to, say, parents, right? That is, it belongs to parents to determine the educational content for their children, right? That's proper to their role as parents, and the state must not interfere with that, right? Now the state can support it, right? Can come alongside and complement it, right? But ultimately the parents, right, have charge of religious education, upbringing, all those sorts of things, right? The state can do things to support that, but it can't do things to replace that, right? Except where no parents are, like if there's adoption or abandonment or some, that sort of situation. So even if the state was directing you to do something good in that area, it has to not violate the scope, right, that belongs to it, right? So interestingly, most people don't know this, but the Catholic Church actually opposed compulsory education when it was originally proposed in the early 20th century, for several reasons, one of which was they didn't think it belonged to the state to compel, right, in that matter, which is really interesting to think about, right? It's kind of an odd issue, but I think it's interesting, right, because that's a bad precedent, right, in a sense. Now, all of that said, with those qualifications, I want to add, and this ties back to, I think, our issue here with about abortion, right? And this is going to be hard kind of from some ways about thinking about American freedom, but that really obeying the political, right, even the human law, right, the law of the state, is an act of freedom, right, when it's within its proper scope and it's for the good, right? So, obeying the stop sign is, I think, a matter of human freedom, right? And like when I obey, I'm not acting, you're slavish, you're stopping it. No, like
slave.
No, I'm being a free, rational animal by obeying this law. Likewise, when we obey the prohibition, maybe in some states, like in, say, the state of Tennessee, in about 25 days, when we obey the law of Tennessee, which will be that, you correct me if I'm wrong about this, Jason, but that abortions will be prohibited except to save the life of the mother, right? When that's being obeyed, that is not a violation of your freedom, right? That is, in fact, giving you the opportunity to freely choose to take your pregnancy to term and raise that child, or secure that child's being raised by someone else.
And again, and I think if we were to, boil this down a little bit, again, because our notion of freedom is always connected to what is good, right? That relationship always has to be there. We can't just simply say that your act of freedom is in a vacuum,
Right.
It can that it doesn't even have to be between two goods. It could be between two evils, and that's an authentic act of freedom. No,
No,
it's not. It's choosing one slave owner to another.
Am I gonna steal tonight or murder? I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe both.
right. Rape or pillage. Which one tonight? Both. Right. Like, so it's like this again, the and this is the key thing. And we can also go back a little bit and say, well, okay, well, what is good? Well, again, this is why you have to have some understanding of the nature of the thing you're talking about. What is good for the human person, right?
That's why Aristotle says,
similar to the,
that's why Aristotle says that the statesman, before he turns to matters of the law, must know about the good life and the human soul.
Yeah.
Good luck today.
That's so true. When you think about so many, where is the, where is there not confusion? But when we're looking for, like, where are the confused points of the culture? Anthropology is a big one. And when we misunderstand the human person, we'll misunderstand freedom. When we misunderstand human person, freedom, then everything else after that, law, society, the family, all of these things will be completely misunderstood, and we'll have the state we're in now, where when we let's just say, we understand what Roe v. Wade did, what the overturning did, but let's just say we have a ban against abortion. And people are outcrying, say, well, this is a restriction on my freedom. Where's my right, my freedom? It's like, well, no, you don't, like, that's not there. You're imagining that, because again, it has to be based on what is good, the design of the human person, the nature of the human person, and therefore society and everything like that. So when we're so again, the connection between freedom and the good must always be there. So
that's right.
For our listeners, keep that in mind when somebody's talking about freedom. Look for the good. Okay, that has to be there. Otherwise there's everything else kind of falls apart if it's just your ability to choose between two different things with no sort of understanding towards what is good. Right.
That's right.
That has to be there. So what kind of moral theory then can you does this kind of turn into, if you have this license or this freedom of indifferent view? What kind of moral theory comes out of it? So we can that freedom is really just the power to choose between two different contraries. There's no place for virtue. That it's free exercise, is free of everything else, including maybe even further consequences. That the law is just this external force that's trying to limit my freedom, right? What kind of moral view or moral theory comes out of this?
I think you could say there's two. One would be voluntarism, which is Ockham's move, right? So the will of the sovereign is ultimately the foundation for morality, right? So it's the unconditioned, unrestrained will of God, right, in Ockham's view, and then that conditions the will of the sovereign, and so it's a divine command kind of approach, right? That's not what we're dealing with today, right? Because I think really what we do is replace replace God with the human will, right? And so I think what we come up with is basically what people want is a system that secures their autonomy, right? Their ability to be a law unto themselves, right? So that we will justify just enough, we'll have enough laws to make it possible for me to be a law unto myself, right? And for my being a law unto myself not to be violated by you or somebody else or the government or something like that. And that will be sufficient. Now, it also means, like, even the laws of economics or nature shouldn't really get in the way, right? So like, I should be able to choose to be, slothful malcontent, and society should still provide for me and also give me medical care
Yeah.
and give me free education and blah 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 blah. Right, higher education. Those are all things that support my autonomy, by being able to do whatever I want, so that I could, not take the steps to be able to pay for myself, provide for myself, and still have nice things. Right? That's the best, right?
Yeah, that's there's so much wrong with that. Yeah. Like,
you're just being mean
I
if
mean,
you say anything contrary, right?
I mean, outside of just, it's completely unworkable. Like, that's impossible to accomplish, right? I think even the communists would say, no, we can't do that, right?
Man,
Like,
I don't know. I mean, what was it the guy at was it Davos said maybe 2 years ago, right? Yeah, like, you'll own nothing, but you'll be happy. I mean,
yeah.
Eat bugs.
Private property. Yeah. Yeah, so it really leaves us in a place where, we're and I think that's a difficult part for the Christian, right? Like, how do you argue against irrationality? It's so difficult,
Mm-hmm.
But and I think a way, though, is to always point to the good, always point to, to and also point to the irrationality of their own argument.
Sure.
To see where there's points where it's just not necessarily consistent. We don't need to be overly emotional or demanding about it, but simply point them out.
Right.
Well, if I have determined that this is good,
right,
who are you to say otherwise, right?
Right.
And even if my good, constricts you in some way, well, who wins?
Right.
Why should your will outwill mine?
Right. Like, I mean, it comes down to sort of like a mutual respect for autonomy, but you can always just come and say, but why? Right. And eventually, you're going to have to you can eventually push somebody back to, well, it's true that we're both autonomous and we should treat like things as like, because it's more just, something like that. In which case you've recognized something that's behind or underneath autonomy, right? And then you should start to correct your moral vision. I think dialectically, what you're always trying to do in an ethical debate is find that point of agreement somewhere.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, right, the person, and you always have to remember this when you're engaging, the truth is that we're right, and that person has a nature that's inclined towards these goods, right? They do actually seek friendship. They do actually seek self-preservation. They do actually seek, nobody wants to be described as I just described, the slothful malcontent, right? Very few people would say, oh yeah, I'm a slothful malcontent, right? No, they always try to justify themselves in some way, right? It's kind of like there's no proud coward, right? For the most part, right? If you find a proud coward, it's a rare, vicious person. You should probably take them to the woods and leave them. Because they're truly not part of the human, they can't be part of the human community, right?
Right.
So there are the truth. So you find that thing, right? Like, okay, but you do actually desire these real goods, right? Why do you desire these real goods? Like, what's the rationale there, right? Give me an explanation, right? And that could at least has the possibility, of opening us up to these to the fuller view of the human person and virtue.
Yeah, and to point out, I think also, that even the person who does believe in this autonomy, this as the highest virtue or the highest good, right? This freedom of indifference, right? This license, that it's not as absolute as they think it is, right? Mm-hmm. And that we can simply begin to point out some inconsistencies, in it. Where we can point out like the law, the place of the law, right?
Sure.
That it's actually there to help us be more free, right? We want to live in a society where people don't murder each other,
of course,
right?
Of course.
Right. And the person, well, who are you to restrict? Yeah. Okay. Well, so, and if we don't, if private property isn't really a thing, well, then it doesn't matter, if I steal your car.
Right.
You know,
sure.
like there's a,
and then you don't have the freedom to use your car to go to work, right? That's
right.
really, yeah.
Right. So yeah, and it keeps compounding. So, you know, I think, you know, for the Christian out there is trying to fight against this, you know, listen very carefully to the argument that's being made, and find the spot of inconsistency, and be gentle in pointing it out, and provide the authentic other side of it, right? Where authentic freedom is something that we grow into. It's something that develops, and it involves the good, it involves virtue, it involves the will, the intellect, reason, like it involves just it involves the whole person. It's not simply compartmentalizing the human person in kind of a dualist way or something like that. You know, so any final thoughts, especially for the 4th of July as we approach?
Sure. Well, I think that just two quick ones. One, that I think, you know, when you're trying to keep this picture in mind clearly, right, is that remember that freedom is for the good because of the nature of the will. And that the nature of the will, right, is it is an inclination and power for choosing the rational good. So that's what makes an action voluntary, is it's consistent with the voluntas, right? That is, it's free when it's consistent with the nature of the will, and that's what makes it freedom. And that is an unusual today way of thinking about freedom, but it's the correct way of thinking about freedom. The second thing I'll say very quickly about the United States of America and our culture and political tradition, I do not think, now I'm not going to pretend that the founders or most of these folks were Thomist or something of that nature, right? That would be incorrect. That said, I think they did have a good number of them had a classical learning in the background, and were familiar with classical ideas about virtue and self-governance and freedom, and that's all correct. And I don't think that the American idea of freedom originally was license or the freedom of indifference. I believe it was about self-governance. And I think that's demonstrable from the things that were written by the founders, right? They talked about liberty, but they also just as much about self-governance. And that idea comes with, right, that they're going to pursue virtue. Now, it might be the case that the founders, in their broad political liberties that they created, maybe.
Yeah.
That was a particular theory, right, that they were developing. But even that they saw as the conditions for the development of virtue. Now, you might think maybe they made the liberties too broad or too narrow. You could argue that. But in terms of what they were trying to get at was a virtuous republic, right? And I think that is something that we can be grateful for, and it's worthy of celebration.
Yeah. Again, like I think you said it very well, right? They weren't aimed at kind of just an autonomous republic, but a virtuous.
No, that's right.
A virtuous one, right? And the way God created us, you know, is with an intellect to know the truth and a will to choose the good, right? That's the design. And when we operate, when we seek the truth and we find it and we act on it and we choose what is genuinely good, we grow not only in freedom, but in excellence and in virtue. And this is, you know, God's plan for the human person. That's right. It's something that we can be happy for, and try to build a just society to where this kind of structure exists where humans can flourish. And that's our goal in all of this. And so thank you, Dr. Smith. And we want to wish everybody a happy 4th of July, and check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.